Just want to say a bit on the Ukrainian incursion into Russia. I'm very tempted to say Ukraine's special military operation. Now, apparently, the latest I've just watched clips from Sky News and the BBC is that there's intense fighting around the Kursk region, and the fighting is moving close to a nuclear power station. The IAEA, not surprisingly, has called on both sides to show restraint. Restraint. It wasn't that long ago. I think it was in late 22 or actually early 2023, where there was a Ukrainian nuclear power station that came close to fighting. So it's very volatile because if there was any mishap there, that could be, well, a very grave situation. Um, I'm not a military strategist, so I'm not sure. I can't really say if this is the right approach or not, but I would imagine that the point of it is it's an elite group of Ukrainians, apparently about 1,000 of them. This won't be regular troops, it's probably going to be elite units. I imagine it's to cause a headache for Putin on his backyard. He's already declared it an act of terrorism, which is obscene. I'll come back to that in a minute, but it means that Putin is forced to get resources into the fighting around Kursk, the Kursk region. The irony, of course, is Kursk is the site of one of World War II's major battles, Battle of Kursk, which was the largest tank battle in history. Um, what I think is interesting about this situation is it changes the dynamic of the war. It's brought it to Russians. Now, I don't think there's any serious moral questions on what Ukraine has done because Ukraine is the victim. Ukraine is the country that was invaded, and they're fighting back. One would be tempted to say Russia's getting a taste of its own medicine, but I do think Ukraine needs to be careful to avoid civilian casualties. You know, if there's a heavy Russian civilian casualties, unfortunately, that won't go down well um, for Ukraine. Not that Russia plays fairly in that regard. I mean, for 2 years, Russia has been terrorizing the Ukrainian people. That's why it's so perverse for Putin to talk about terrorism. The other irony about this is Putin's whole justification for the Ukraine war, apart from his lies that Russia's surrounded by NATO, was his irredentist obsessions, and he basically sees no border. He sees Ukraine as part of Russia. So I don't know what the Kremlin propagandists are framing this as, but they can't talk about an invasion by Ukraine if they don't even recognize Ukraine. So technically, this would be an internal Russian conflict in Putin's worldview, or in theory, so you would think. Um, I initially thought I wondered about the sense of doing this because Russia's clearly got significantly bigger army than Ukraine, so does it make sense to span out resources rather than keeping the battlefield within Ukraine? But maybe there is some strategy to this, and so far it looks like the Ukrainians are prevailing. Apparently, they've gained 530 square kilometers of territory, which is significant. Um, and it's not that the Russians are in full retreat, but I think certainly it would have taken Russia by surprise. And I think it's definitely put Putin on the back footing. He'll bring in anti-terror powers. There's going to be a lot of closing down of information. But one good thing about it is any Russians that see this in the Kursk region, it will shatter the misconception that Putin has the situation under control. And alongside the Wagner rebellion last year, it's going to be another message to the Russians that the president isn't as strong as he would like to portray. That doesn't mean they're going to be pro-Ukrainian. They're going to be angry with the Ukrainians, but it's going to make Putin look weak. That's a good thing. Anything that weakens Putin is good as far as I'm concerned. Um, so yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I hope there's minimal civilian casualties. I think there's been some so far, but one thing is absolutely certain: Ukraine is focusing on military targets. Contrast that to what Russia done. I mean, the gall of Putin talking about terrorism. A month ago, on the same day that I left for the Philippines, Russia bombed a children's cancer hospital. Yesterday, a supermarket killing 14 people. In the cancer hospital incident, dozens killed, dozens more wounded. That's absolutely state terrorism by Russia, and it's been doing it for 2 years. Thousands of Ukrainian civilians have been killed and wounded in Russian state terrorism. There's been atrocities like Bucha and Kramatorsk. Um, there will be some around the world who pretend to be neutral, but can continue to serve as kind of apologists for Putin in the sense that they regurgitate Kremlin propaganda about NATO. I'm thinking of Narendra Modi of India and Lula da Silva of Brazil. Both leaders have pandered to Putin, and they haven't openly backed Putin's invasion of Ukraine. They haven't done that, but they have regurgitated Kremlin lies, basically, which I think is a disgrace. Um, so it may well be that there'll be. I've no doubt there'll be Indian networks that will frame this as a provocation against Russia. In Nigel Farage land, maybe it's a provocation. Um, but I have no moral issues with it because this war was brought to Ukraine. Ukraine is targeting military sites in Russia. Russia started this. Ukraine is pushing back. But like I say, they need to be careful to avoid civilian casualties because otherwise they'd reduce themselves to Russian level. I don't think there's any moral equivalency. But if there was mass Russian casualties, then it would just become that. Well, that wouldn't be good. The world needs to see Russian state terrorism, and the problem is if there's Russian civilian casualties, it'll be harder to frame it that way. Um, Also, there's just the moral question. I don't think there's civilians should be avoided in war. That's a no-brainer. On like what Russia has been doing for 2 years. Um, on some wider issues around that much hailed prisoner exchange recently, it's going to be one of those things that probably will go down well in Biden's legacy. Apparently, Olaf Scholz personally told Biden that he would do it for Biden. That is to say, the Russian bicycle killer that was sent back east. The West got more people, but if you compare the two, the West it's journalists. Russia, it's contract killers, so there's no comparison there. I mean, it's good for their families, people like Evan Gershkovich and Vladimir Kara-Murza. I think it's great for their families, but they're going to have a lot of, no doubt they'll need counselling, they'll need a lot of rebuilding. Gershkovich looked like he'd come out of a concentration camp. That was very good news. However, it came at a price. Russia got back some of its spies and killers. Um, Apparently, there's been a feud that's broken out between some of those Russian dissidents and Ukraine. Ukraine takes a view that there's a collective responsibility in Russia. Those Russian dissidents say that, for example, sanctions targeting all Russians backfire because they tie into Putin's propaganda. Um, I sort of understand both sides. I mean, I'm not comfortable with all Russians being collectively punished because there are courageous Russians who have faced long prison sentences and even death for standing up to Putin. But the Ukrainian point is making this analogy with Germany in World War II, and there is some truth in that, in the way that Russia operates. So, yes, there is courageous dissidents, but no question about it, many Russians are brainwashed by the Kremlin. So, in that sense, Putin still has a lot of control, and therefore, it's pointless saying those people are. It's just Putin and the rest of Russia is decent. I think that's wrong. Um, but the focus should be on. I think for Ukraine to get into a feud with Russian dissidents would be wasted energy. It's because both sides want to see the end of Putin, so it's not. I don't think the focus should be on that debate. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I hope there's minimal civilian casualties. Every young Russian who is killed in this war, that's blood on Putin's hands. And I honestly, certainly some of them are war criminals, but I do sympathise with a poor country boy from Siberia with no prospects in life who's died on the battlefields of Ukraine. Ukraine's also lost a lot of young men, but they're fighting a moral cause. The Russians aren't. There was a sad thing I saw yesterday of Ukrainian athletes who would have been in Paris, but they've been killed on the battlefield. Um, Putin has so much blood on his hands, it's unbelievable. And I feel so disgusted by Putin apologists, whether they be in the West or elsewhere. But yeah, this definitely is a different trajectory. We'll see how it plays out in the long term. I hope it weakens Putin, but time will tell.